So tissues are collections of specialized cells and cell products that perform a limited number of functions. And the study of tissues is referred to as histology. And this is actually a very, large branch of lab studies where they might look for abnormal tissue types, especially, with a lot of disorders that are involving certain types of cancers and stuff. So there are four basic types of tissues. Epithelial tissue, connective tissue, which is the largest and most abundant throughout the body. Muscle tissue, there's three types of muscles, and nervous tissue. And we're going to talk about all four of these in a second. And again, this will be the first recording of probably a few. So looking at the different types of tissues here, and you can see this little schematic here where you can have tissues that are formed from cells, but also tissues that contain other materials, which we call extracellular material. This is anything but cells. And if we look at the four different types of tissues, we have epithelial tissue. This typically will cover that of exposed surfaces. It lines internal passageways as well as any chambers. And it can also produce glandular secretions. Most glands in your body are actually formed from epithelial tissue. Connective tissue, this tends to fill internal spaces. It also helps provide structural support. And it's also a great source of stored up energy. For example, adipose, which is fat. Muscle tissue, this will contract to produce active movement. And there are three different types of connective tissue. Skeletal muscle, which is involved in all of your voluntary movements. Smooth muscle, which moves things throughout your body. You actually do not have conscious control over that type of muscle. And cardiac muscle, which is only found in the heart. And again, you don't have conscious control over that either. Finally, the fourth type of tissue is nervous tissue. This will propagate electrical impulses as well as carry various information to and from the central nervous system. These four different types of tissue types will come together to form organs with multiple functions. And they will interact within organ systems, which is what we're going to talk about in chapters 5 through 20 here, starting to get into the various types of organ systems. So looking at epithelial tissue, it covers internal and external body surfaces. It composes most glands, and it serves essential functions. Some of those essential functions are that the cells are bound very closely together, and you'll actually have what we call a free or apical surface. This is the exposed surface. And then it's attached to an underlying connective tissue by what we call a basement membrane. So wherever you have epithelial tissue, which is most likely a barrier because it's a bunch of cells just all lined up next to each other, underneath of that connective tissue, you will have, underneath that epithelial tissue, you will have connective tissue. Now, epithelial tissue is avascular, which means it does not contain any blood vessels. The underlying connective tissue in the basement membrane is vascularized. So that's where the nutrients will come from, is from that connective tissue that underlies the epithelial tissue. Because of the nature of epithelial tissue and the fact that it acts as a barrier and it's exposed to various types of surfaces, you'll see continual replacement or regeneration of the cells. Now, where would you find epithelial tissue? It will cover external and internal body surfaces, for example, your skin, your internal passageways, which would include your digestive tract. Again, your digestive tract would be sort of your oral cavity, your esophagus, stomach, large, small intestines, anal, rectal area. The respiratory system, which would include the trachea and the bronchial tree. The urinary system, which would include your bladder, ureters, urethra, and then the reproductive tracts. Epithelial tissue will form what we call selective barriers. These will line internal cavities as well and passageways. For example, the cavities around the lungs, the heart, these are all formed by epithelial tissue. And what these cavities do is they allow you to set up a friction-free environment so that when these tissues actually end up contracting or moving, you don't have tissue rubbing on tissue. So functions of the epithelial tissue is it will provide physical protection, control permeability, provide sensation, and also produce specialized secretions, especially with our glandular epithelial tissue. As I mentioned, all glands are formed from epithelial tissue, epithelial cells that produce secretions. They are classified by where and how the secretions are discharged. And we have two primary types of glandular tissue. Exocrine, where secretions are discharged onto the surface of the epithelium, and endocrine, where secretions, which are called hormones, are released into the surrounding fluid and blood. One of the big differences is that exocrine secretions are local secretions. They affect the immediate area of the gland. Endocrine secretions, however, because they're secreted into the bloodstream, are what we refer to as systemic secretions, and they will end up ultimately traveling throughout the entire body. Now, epithelial tissues, because they form barriers, they're going to have various types of cell junctions. You're going to have primarily what we call tight junctions, which are going to be held together by spot desmosomes. I like to think of the spot desmosomes as sort of like little welds holding the tissue together. And if you look here in this figure, you can see the gap junctions here. The gap junctions' job are to permit communication from one cell to the next. This is one cell here, here's the other cell. They're very closely attached to each other, and this is like a little tubule that will allow transport of materials between the two cells. Here we see tight junctions, and here you can see the wall of one cell and the wall of another cell are tightly bound to each other. And this actually prevents things from actually passing through. Okay, and those are the two main things I want you guys to focus on out of these cell junctions. Now looking at the epithelial surface, we have the apical surface, which is exposed to an internal or external environment. Oftentimes it will have specialized structures such as microvilli. Microvilli, if you remember from the cell chapter, these are invaginations of the plasma membrane, and the main job of the microvilli is to increase surface area. An example of where we would find microvilli is the small intestinal mucosal membranes. You can also have cilia, which are actual projections off the cell to help move materials along and across the surface of the lining. And this is something that we very commonly see within the respiratory tract. So looking at the basement membrane, as we talked about this, the basement membrane is going to lie between the epithelial tissue and the underlying connective tissue. It's typically composed of non-cellular network of protein fibers, and the functions of the basement membrane are to provide strength, resist distortion, and to act as a barrier to other proteins and other large molecules. Because most epithelial tissue acts as a barrier, it's going to undergo a lot of stress and wearing down. And epithelial renewal and repair will require continued repair mechanisms to be in place. This is accomplished by continuous division of unspecified stem cells, which we refer to as germinative cells, which will produce new cells to replace the old damaged ones. Now, these regenerative cells typically are found very close to the basement membrane. They're sort of found at what we call the basal level. And as these cells get produced, they get pushed up towards the apical surface. Now, there are several different types of epithelial tissue, and they can be classified by the number of layers, whether you have simple, which is one layer, or stratified, which is more than one layer, or they can be shaped by the exposed cells. We have squamous, which are flat cells, cuboidal, which are in the cube shape, and columnar, which are column shaped. So looking at the different types of epithelial tissue, we have simple epithelium, and by its name, it's a single layer, that's what simple means, of cells covering a basement membrane. It's usually very fragile. So it's not something you'd see for a very protective membrane. It's more of just a very simple barrier. It lines internal compartments and passageways. It's also common where secretion, absorption, and transport take place. Examples of simple epithelium would be the air sacs in the lung, which are referred to as alveoli, kidney tubules, small intestinal mucosa membranes, and the inner lining of blood vessels. Stratified epithelium, this is multiple layers of cells. When you have the multiple layers, this oftentimes will provide greater protection, and it's found in areas exposed to mechanical or chemical stress. Examples here would include the skin, vaginal lining, and the upper esophageal lining. When looking at squamous epithelium, again, these are flat cells. Okay, cuboidal, these are cube-shaped, and columnar or column-shaped. So let's look at the different types of epithelial tissue. You should be able to actually recognize these by these pictures as well. And your textbook has very good images of these right off the bat here. Okay, so the first one is simple squamous epithelium. The main function of simple squamous epithelium is to reduce friction, also controls vessels permeability, which means allowing things to pass through, and performs absorption and secretion. You do want to know the functions of each type of tissue. Simple cuboidal epithelium, this has limited protection, secretion, and absorption. And you'll typically find this in kidney tubules, would be a very common place to see this. The third type on this particular panel here is simple columnar epithelium. This is going to be involved in protection, secretion, and absorption. And we'll find this in the lining of the stomach, intestines, gallbladder, uterine or fallopian tubes, as well as the collecting ducts of the kidneys. So here again, just sort of summarizes the three types of tissues that I just went over there. Now looking at some of our multi-layered ones, we have stratified squamous epithelium. This provides physical protection against abrasion, pathogens, as well as any chemical attacks. And you'll find this on the surface lining of the skin, lining of the mouth, throat, esophagus, rectum, anus, and vaginal tract. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Now this is going to have those cilia. Pseudostratified is actually a funny one. It's actually a single layer, but it looks like it has multiple layers. It's going to be involved in protection, secretion, as well as moving mucus with the cilia. And you'll typically find this lining the respiratory tract. Transitional epithelium, this is only found in the urinary tract. This permits expansion and recoil after stretching. Your bladder and your urinary structures actually do not stay patent, which means they don't stay open. When they're empty, they will collapse. And when they start to fill up with urine, what happens is you start to expand the walls, and this transitional epithelium allows for that to happen. So again, the pseudostratified columnar epithelium, this appears layered from multiple positions of nuclei, but it's actually only really one cell layer thick. All your cells will be in contact with the basement membrane. Not all cells will reach the apical surface. So it gives the appearance that there's multiple layers. These cells typically have cilia. They're involved in movement of materials such as mucus. And again, this is something that we typically see in the respiratory tract. Transitional epithelium is stratified epithelium. The appearance changes with stretching. And this is something that we really see in the urinary tract. As I mentioned, you also have various types of glandular tissue, which will be formed of epithelial tissue. Exocrine glands, again, will discharge the secretions through a duct or tube, but these are going to discharge them locally onto external or internal surfaces. Endocrine glands are ductless, but they actually will release their secretions. And endocrine secretions are hormones, which will get released into the blood. Anything that gets released into the blood is referred to as systemic, and it will travel throughout the entire body. So this just goes over the different types of secretion. And this is something you want to look over. Okay, merocrine, apocrine, holocrine, these are different types of exocrine glands that can exist. And then we also have other types of secretion, such as serous fluid. This is something that's very popular, especially with your salivary glands. Mucus, this is a thick, slippery mucus, and this type of secretion is found throughout the body. And you get various mixed types of secretions as well. So just look over this little table, which is also found in your book there. And this will be the end of the first recording, going over sort of an intro to tissues as well as epithelial tissues. The second recording will get into connective tissues, muscle, and nervous tissue. Okay.